My Govanen. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and recently the channel In Deep Geek by Robert put out a really interesting video on the subject of why Gollum fell into the crack of doom. If you don't know In Deep Geek, he's actually part of the same kind of fellowship of Tolkien YouTubers that I've done a couple of collaborations with over this past year, and he puts out some really good stuff. So I'm going to link his video in the description below. Go check it out, preferably before you watch this, because it'll provide some useful context. Give it a like, and if you think he's got some good stuff, and he does, go subscribe to his channel. He talks about things other than Tolkien, so you'll find some other stuff there as well, but if you're into Tolkien, he's definitely worth following just for that. That said, the basis of his video is questioning why Gollum fell into the crack of doom, and he basically goes over the theory that Frodo essentially cursed him to fall into the crack of doom when just prior to entering Mount Doom, Gollum of course attacks Sam and Frodo, and when Frodo gets a chance to recover himself and he's not under direct attack, he's holding the ring and basically saying, if you ever touch me again, you will fall yourself into the crack of doom. And basically he goes through a lot of the previous points in the book where this idea has come up, talking about how Gollum was a slave to the ring, how Frodo even tells him much earlier, I would command you to jump into the fire or cast yourself off of a cliff, both rather relevant considerations, if he tried to take the ring from him. And so all these things kind of build up to this idea that Frodo is basically the reason that Gollum fell in, because he's holding the ring as he says this to Gollum just before they enter Mount Doom, and he ends up fulfilling exactly the thing that Frodo says. So I'm going to take a look at some other possibilities for what could have done this and explore those, and we'll see what we think by the end. So In Deep Geek's analysis is totally spot on. It's great stuff, and I think his theory holds up. But there's two other theories that we need to look at that are also at least plausible, and the first of those is the idea that Gollum falls in because of his own wretched cupidity. Cupidity, that means greed, essentially. His lust for the ring and his enslavement to it, which is, at least in part a result of his own, evil character at the very outset, are at least as good an explanation as any as to why Gollum falls off the edge. Now, of course, if you've seen the movie and never read the book, this won't make a whole lot of sense, because in the movie, Gollum gets pushed off by Frodo, and that has really nothing to do with what goes on in the book. In the book, what happens is when he gets the ring from Frodo, he's dancing around, and he goes too far, steps over the edge himself, and just hurtles to the bottom, all by himself. So he is so overcome with joy at recovering his precious that he just loses control, quite literally, and doesn't know he's not paying attention to what he's doing, falls over the edge, and he's a goner. So this is part of a common theme in Tolkien's works that we can see operating on a number of villainous, or even not villainous, but not ideal hero characters, where their own bad decision-making or their own bad motives will catch up to them and prove self-defeating. And I've made comments on this before in other videos about how self-defeating evil is. I think I did a video dedicated to the topic. If I can find it, I will link to that in the description as well. But examples of this would be, for instance, Sauron's own creation of the ring. He's using it to dominate others, but it ends up being his downfall, because once it's destroyed, he is impotent. He has no power left. He's basically reduced to a negligible thing floating around in the universe of what we know as Middle-earth. So there's this idea that evil is its own self-defeating mechanism. It creates its own fall. And in this case, a literal fall in Gollum's case, because he's literally falling off a cliff, and it's because early on we see that at least Gandalf's reconstruction of what must have happened in the past is that Smeagol takes the ring from Diagal out of greed, essentially, and he takes it from him and kills him in the process, and becomes completely enslaved to the ring over the next 500 years while he's you know, rotting away, morally speaking, in the Misty Mountains. And so this idea that he wanted it so bad to begin with, and then of course becomes ever more enslaved to the ring over time, and then when he doesn't have it, we can see every now and then hints that he might be redeemed. And there's even comments about this in the Council of Elrond in the book, where the elves are saying, you know, that they let him out from a cage that they had him in to climb up in a tree that they would watch, so that he would, you know, maybe over time come back to something like his old self. Not that his old self was particularly good, but it, you know, better than Gollum at any rate. So there's these ideas that are planted throughout the book, and there's one scene in particular where they're crossing the pass of Cirith Ungol, where he comes back apparently after having gone to Shelob, basically saying, hey, I've got these hobbits, they're coming, it won't be long now. And he comes back and Frodo and Sam are both asleep, and the narrator describes him looking at them, almost looking like just an old wizened hobbit, and he reaches out to touch Frodo with what could be characterized as a caress, and it's just the idea that he's seeing Frodo and Sam resting peacefully together, and it almost brings him back, and then Sam wakes up and misconstrues what's going on, gets onto him, and he ruins the moment. But the point is, there's these hints that Gollum is at least potentially redeemable and maybe on the path to redemption. And you have to wonder if in that instance, had Sam not woken up and done what he did, would Gollum have gone through with the whole Shelob plan? Not clear. At any rate, Gollum, of course, after the berating by Sam, that's gone. That's out of the picture. He never does anything friendly to him again. He ends up running off, eventually follows them all the way to Mount Doom, attacks them, and at this point his desire to get the ring is pretty much at its max, because A, he's been betrayed and he hates him more than ever. B, they're at Mount Doom, which is, as we can tell from Frodo's own experience, where the ring is its most potent. And C, he knows that Frodo is about to try to destroy the ring, which means if it's not now, it's never. Gollum knows if he doesn't get it back, he's never going to get it back at this point. And he even tells Sam right after the attack and Frodo heads to Mount Doom, he, you know, basically says, you know, if the ring goes, I will die. He says we'll die, of course, because he's talking about himself and his precious. But he's anticipating dying because he's been around for 500 years, and once the power of the ring that kept him alive is gone, what's he going to do? Turn into dust? We don't really know. But he's not going to live forever. And frankly, just his own enslavement to it would be, you know, if the ring is gone permanently, that would be a pretty severe blow. So he's not expecting anything good to come out of this. So his desire for the ring is at its max, and he's been without it for 77 years, you know, give or take. So when he finally gets the ring from Frodo, after having traveled with Frodo all this time and all this other stuff, he's elated beyond anything you can imagine. And so he's, you know, just completely gone ballistic as far as his emotional state. He has no control. And it's precisely his lack of control due to his own greed and his enslavement by the ring that leads him to not pay attention and fall off. So that's one of the other theories. Let's take a look at one other theory and then come back and compare all three and see what we think. So the other theory that we need to talk about is the idea that the ring being destroyed by Gollum falling off is more or less an act of providence. And providence is definitely at play in the Lord of the Rings. It's never very explicit in the sense of there's no reference to a god who is ordaining events, but there are definitely references to the idea that things are being guided in history. Gandalf, of course, tells Frodo Bilbo was meant to find the ring and not by its maker, and that may be an encouraging thought. Gandalf, of course, is probably referring here to Eru Ilúvatar, who is the god figure that we learn about in the Silmarillion, not so much in the Lord of the Rings. But we get other references to this idea as well. I mean, there's plenty of them strewn throughout the whole story. We even get a reference in one of the chapters where Frodo is with Faramir, that a couple of the guys with Faramir start talking about a Mumak, one of the Oliphants, attacking, and one of them says, "May the Valar turn him aside." this is really the only reference explicitly to the Valar, other than a couple that we get by name, but whose identity as Valar are not really made explicit. I mean, we get a reference to Orome as a comparison to Theoden. We get references to Elbereth in some of the Elvish songs, but we don't know who these people are, and we don't really know who the Valar are. But if you know your Silmarillion and you know that the Valar are kind of like demigods, then there again is kind of an invocation of providence. And the whole eagles thing as well is a very providential type of situation. A lot of people complain that the eagles are kind of a deus ex machina. Well, yes, they kind of are, because that is almost exactly what they are. They are almost literally an act of God, in the sense that, the eagles are associated with Manwe the Vala, not Eru Ilúvatar. But it's more or less the same thing. It's not really a deus ex machina, because that's technically a different thing. In Tolkien, it's a very specific idea of, the eagles are an instrument of the Valar in making sure that things turn out okay. And this gets into something else as well, because not only in the story itself do we have these references to providence, explicit or implicit. Tolkien himself wrote a letter, which apparently was never sent, or if it was a different version of it. But there's a draft letter, which is number 246 in the Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. If you have that, you can look it up, where he's writing to somebody who wrote him about the, quote, failure, unquote, of Frodo to destroy the ring. And he gets into this discussion of, it wasn't a moral failure on Frodo's part. Frodo, at this point, literally could not have resisted, the power of the ring, which was at its maximum potency. He had been through all kinds of, really debilitating events that, wore down his willpower. And it's questionable, I don't remember if he brings this up specifically in the letter, but along the same lines, it's questionable whether Frodo could have done it ever under even ideal circumstances, because when Gandalf and Frodo are talking in Frodo's home at Bag End, Gandalf, basically asks him, see if you could throw it in the fire, try it. And Frodo looks at it, and he goes through this mental process of like, why would I destroy this really beautiful thing? And the next thing you know, it's in his pocket. And so, could Frodo ever have destroyed the ring? Questionable. So Tolkien in this letter, or draft letter, makes the point that his humility and his mercy to Gollum and his pity had kind of earned him the right of a providential intervention. It was rewarded in a sense by Gollum falling in, because he had done what he could do. He went as far as he could on his own power and made it to a point where the quest could be achieved, whether by his strength or not. He didn't have the strength, therefore it had to be achieved in a different way. And so the reward for that was, it will be achieved. It came with a cost, of course, and under this theory, you might even look at the cursing that Frodo does of Gollum, if curse it be considered. You might almost say that, in a sense, is punished by him losing his finger. Did he have to lose his finger? Could it have gone down a slightly different way? Possibly. But it at least raises the possibility that in that moment, Frodo gave in a little bit too much to his own influence by the ring in cursing Gollum, because that's not something he wanted to do, and he made it pretty clear at other points. Even when he was talking to Gollum earlier about, if you tried to take the ring from me, this is what I would command you to do. You get the idea there that he's saying, this is not what I want to do, but if I was pushed to that limit, that's exactly what would happen, and that you don't want to go there. So you get the impression maybe that Frodo losing his finger is, but keeping his life, is like a double punishment reward, double-edged sword there, where he gets to live and enjoy, in a sense, the fruits of the victory, but he's, he doesn't get to come out unscathed. So that's the providence theory. Now, looking at all three theories, we have some really interesting plausibility to all three. Obviously, like I mentioned before, the idea of one's own evil catching up to you and, you know, being your own downfall, that's a common theme. Thorin ends up dying because his greed is too much. And we see that over and over again in Tolkien's characters. Thorin is not a villain, but he lets things get too out of hand on his own, you know, his own moral standing. And we see that in villains. We see that in some of the heroes like Boromir. You know, his own desire for the ring ends up costing him his life. We also see, you know, the plausibility of the curse theory, because it works out so neatly. Frodo mentions twice, you know, like cast yourself into the fire, cast yourself into the fire, into the crack of doom, you know, and that's exactly what ends up happening to Gollum. Seems a little bit too coincidental for that not to be, you know, an outgrowth of the curse. And then there's the providence theory, which providence is very clearly, you know, evidenced throughout the story if you really pay attention. So which theory fits best? I think really the answer is all three, because if you think about it, the outgrowth of the curse is itself just a way of having providence work its way, and Gollum's own evil works right along with that, because it's his own evil that sets the curse in motion. And so really all three of these can be true at the same time, and I don't think that Tolkien would necessarily shy away from multiple explanations being, you know, all at play at the same time in causing something like that. So while I think In Deep Geek's video is really great, I do think these other two theories also play into it, and all three reasons are ultimately kind of, in a sense, one and the same. The providence is, you know, kicking in because Frodo did what he had to do, and providence had to supply what was lacking, which it was always going to have to do, probably. And then the way it plays out is more or less determined by Gollum's greed setting off the curse that Frodo himself had made on Gollum. So that, I think, is really what's going on there. Is it's all of these different things kind of making it play out the specific way it does, but, you know, providence, you could say, alone was going to determine that the ring was going to go to the fire, but the other two kind of determine the specific way in which it goes in. So that's my take on In Deep Geek's video and this idea of why Gollum fell into the fire at the very end of the story. And if you have other theories that you think might be applicable, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Again, do check out In Deep Geek's video, even if you saved it for after this one. It's well worth looking into, especially because I didn't go over all the evidence that he does. I wanted to keep that kind of short. But if you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around as well. Do that with In Deep Geek's video as well. And you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore for some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions. You can you can subscribe to the channel here, you can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.